how we grew up, the adults who role modeled communication for us, and what we perceive as being good or bad through our biases all impact what we perceive as conflict. This is why one of the most important life skills that most people are not taught and don't get the chance to learn is how to have a difficult conversation. My name is Via. I have 2 master's degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. I also co-taught a conflict communication course there. And I have 10 plus years of experience in healthcare where I help design effective patient communication strategies for care teams and clinicians. We'll go over what you need to do to feel prepared for a difficult conversation, what to do during a difficult conversation, and the mindset that you need to have to make sure that the conversation is as productive as possible. Now I should specify that what I'm going to be discussing is going to be useful for a one-on-one conversation where it's just you talking to one other person. Step 1 is to get a sense of what you're feeling and where you're feeling it in your body. Because whenever we get triggered, people tend to feel it in different parts of their bodies. Some people feel it in their chest, some people feel it in their temples, some people start to clench their fists. It's important to notice where the tension is developing in your body as you're experiencing conflict. So for example, whenever I get really tense or I feel like I'm in conflict with someone, I start to feel it in my chest and I start to hold my breath. When I notice that I'm starting to tense up and I'm starting to hold my breath, then I pause and think, I was just activated. What happened right before I started holding my breath? This person was silent for 5 seconds. Why does silence bother me? Oh, it's because whenever I got in trouble as a kid, my parents gave me the silent treatment. I should remind myself that during this conversation, silence doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. This person just could be thinking. So this is why we should be aware of whatever triggers that we have, where we feel it in our body, because we're using these as signals to bring us back to the center so that we can be grounded in the conversation and not get highly activated. The next thing that you need to do is prepare and know your objectives. Yes, before going into any heated conflict discussion or negotiation, it's important to have a plan. Have an idea of what you want to get out of the conversation. I want you to think of your objectives through 3 different perspectives. And I like to call this the triple R framework. The first R stands for reputation, the second R stands for requirements, and the third R stands for requests. So first R is reputation. When I say reputation, what I mean is go into the conversation with an awareness of what kind of reputation you want to uphold during the conversation, because things are going to get heated. How do I want to show up? What are the behaviors that I want to demonstrate? What are the qualities that I want to embody where I would be proud of myself no matter what happens during the conversation? In the middle of a conflict, it can be really easy to lose control of ourselves and say things that we don't mean. But what we want to do is think ahead and think about what kind of reputation you want to uphold during the conversation, and try to stick to that as much as you can. The next R is requirements. Usually whenever a conflict happens, it's because we have an unmet need. There's something that we're not getting out of the other person, or there's something that we feel is missing. So what I want you to do is think about what are the requirements that you want, where if it were met through this conversation, you would be happy. Maybe there wouldn't even be a conflict at all. Is it that you require appreciation from this person because you haven't felt appreciated by them in a while? Is it that you require to be listened to by this person because you feel like they haven't been hearing you or understanding you? Is it that you require clarity because this person has been vague and it's been confusing you and leading to all sorts of miscommunication and conflict? What is it that you require that if you received it would actually make the situation better for the both of you? The last R stands for requests. If you could make a request from this person that you're speaking to, what would it be? Maybe you could make a request for whatever it is that you require. If we feel like we're developing an understanding or connection with the other person and the conflict is starting to become resolved, and we see an opportunity to make a request, we can just ask for that. We forget that other people don't know what we're thinking. Other people are not mind readers. They won't know what we want or what we need unless we communicate with them. So if you could make a request, what would that be? Ultimately, if you are in a conflict and you're prepared for the conversation with these 3 R's in mind, you're positioned to manage yourself well throughout the conversation. The next step is to take the triple R framework and put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're speaking with. We have to remember that having an effective conversation means that we're not talking at someone, but we're actually taking them along the journey with our train of thought. This involves having some level of understanding of what their mindset is when they're going into the conversation with us. So ask yourself the same questions that we just asked ourselves in the Triple R framework, but put yourself in their position. What do I know about this person? And how do I anticipate that they're going to show up? What's a reputation that they have that's important to them to uphold? What are their requirements? What are some things that I know that they might want or crave out of this situation? Lastly, is there a request that I can anticipate them making of me? If so, what is my answer to that? Is there anything that I have to offer to them that I'm willing to give? The point of this exercise is to anticipate how the other person might respond. You might find that if you run through this exercise of imagining what life is like for that other person in this situation, we start to develop an empathy with them, and we also start to think through things that we may not have considered before. And if they behave in ways that you expect, then you're prepared to not be hijacked by your emotions if and when things get heated during the conflict. So when it's time to have your conversation, your first words set the tone. Open up with connection. Thank them for meeting with you. State the reason why you're meeting with them and what your intent is for the conversation. Also, make sure that you honor them by taking responsibility for anything that led up to the conflict that was your fault. Acknowledging these things up front sets the tone for the conversation to be more productive, because then the other person knows that it's not a winner takes all conversation and it's not combative. You're really there to have a conversation and to find a way forward so that your relationship is better in the future. Another thing to remember is don't make assumptions. Trying to figure out the motivation behind why someone is acting the way they are or saying what they say is not our job. That's where a lot of conflict happens, is when we make assumptions about why someone is doing something or why someone is saying something. Maybe they're trying to get back at us. They're doing this to manipulate us, blah, 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 blah. Whenever we do this, we're just setting ourselves up for failure because we're creating a fight in our heads when really what's required of us is to be present in the conversation and to pay attention to the other person. Hear the words they say, observe what they do, don't make assumptions. Stay present in the reality of what is happening. I know it's hard, but stay present. As you're speaking with each other, it's important to give affirmations. When we're in the middle of a conflict conversation, there are going to be some things that the other person says that hurts our feelings that we take critically, but the other person could be right. So affirm the feelings that the other person might have that you would also feel offense towards if you were in their shoes. So for example, saying something like, hey, I can see how it came off like I ignored you during that meeting when you made that comment and I didn't say anything return. If that happened to me, I would have felt the same way. Simple as that. It might be tempting to start giving reasons for why we behaved a certain way, but here is when you have to use your senses and decide whether or not it's a good time to explain something and give reasons, because if someone is activated, the last thing that they want to hear is an excuse. So use your best judgment during the situation. If somebody is heated, what you want to do is affirm their situation, listen, and that's it. Use what that person is saying and how they're reacting as data to understand the root of the conflict. Also, don't be afraid to take breaks if you feel that the conversation is getting too heated. Oftentimes, this can make for a more productive conversation rather than trying to power through when you're both feeling energetically squished and things are not going well. Something I've taught my students whenever they feel like they need a break in the conversation is to use the statements, I am, I want, and I will. So saying something like, I'm feeling really stressed out by this conversation right now. I can imagine that you are too, but I want to have this conversation so that we can both figure out a path forward. I will step out and I'll get a glass of water, but I'll come back at 3:40. How does that sound? So what you're doing here is you're laying your cards on the table. You're saying what your current thinking and your state of mind is, I am. You're saying that you still want to reconnect, I want, and you are making a promise with a deadline to return to this conversation because you want it to happen. I will. Another thing that you can do throughout the conversation is to ask good questions. Asking questions during a conflict is a form of motivational interviewing. It's a way to get more information out of that person to understand what is going on their side that is causing this conflict, and what can I do with that information in order to make the situation better for myself and for the both of us. Oftentimes, conflict happens because of miscommunication, lack of information, or information that's communicated in an unclear way. One way to ask thoughtful questions is to do a repeat back of what somebody is saying, making an empathetic guess, and then asking if that guess is correct. It could be something like, I noticed how when it took me 2 days to respond to that email, you called it leaving you in the dark. I'm guessing that sending you more frequent updates, even short ones, would be something that you would want. Would it be helpful if I started doing that more? It would be easy for me to perceive this person as a micromanager, but in the working world, or even in any kind of relationship, part of our job, if you want to maintain a relationship, is to figure out how to exist with the other person. So the things that we learn by asking questions are things that we can use in order to make sure that the relationship goes well. Now, let's revisit the last 2 R's of the triple R framework. If you feel like this conversation is going well, and you feel like you are able to make a request to have a need met or a requirement met from the other person, you can make a request. Now, a productive way to make a request is say what you need, suggest something that can be done to meet that need, and then ask for it. As always, when we're working with other people, nothing is ever guaranteed. They could say yes or they could say no, and we have to be okay with either outcome. But if you've been bridging connection by asking thoughtful questions, affirming their side of the story, you'll start to find that people tend to want to reciprocate. They'll want to give you something in return. And if you have a clear request that's easy for them to do, then very likely, often than not, they will give it to you. After the conversation is over, you might be having a mix of feelings. You could feel relieved, you could feel clear-headed, you can feel even more anxious than before. All of that is normal and fine. But this is when you go back to the triple R framework: your reputation, your requirements and your needs, and your requests. Were any of those met? Did you show up the way you wanted to show up, and did you maintain the reputation that you want to have? If you did, and you stayed composed, and you didn't make assumptions towards the other person, and you didn't get angry and get overactivated, then you've won. This is a really productive way to end a conversation. In terms of requirements, did you get your need met? Or did you at least introduce this need and start to discuss ways where your needs can be met? That's also a win, because you've opened up the conversation to a place that it wasn't before. And then lastly, if you actually made a request, whether it was met or not, putting it out there and showing your hand a little bit to the other person is a form of connection, because they now know a little bit more about you. Even if they're not ready to meet that request now, they could be in the future, because now they know what you want. It's perfectly normal to need multiple conversations to resolve a conflict. If you solve everything and the conflict is dissolved in this one conversation, great. But often it takes time. You need to talk to this person more than once. And if that's the case, then you just go through a series of steps that we discussed already. But what's important to do is make sure that you actively follow up to schedule this conversation, and then you set a time. Remember that anything that has to do with other humans is an art, not a series of logical steps that if you follow them, everything is going to go perfectly as planned. This ability to sit in the discomfort of being in conflict with a person while still remaining grounded is a skill that most people don't realize that they need to develop until they've had a conflict in their workplace, until they've had a conflict in their relationship. And then they realize, oh, I actually need to develop these skills of learning how to communicate and stay in a relationship with people who are different than me. But practicing this can help reduce your stress overall. We're usually not stressed because we're busy or we're overworked. We're usually stressed because of conflict. When you can manage conflict well, you're not stressed. You're prepared. Conflict is unavoidable, but in the end, if you're able to maintain relationships with people with different conflict and communication styles, it makes you more competent and poised, and you can engage with anyone. Anyway, folks, that's it for this video. If it was helpful, please feel free to comment below and subscribe to my channel. Tell me what resonated with you the most. Until next time, take care.